Hey, and welcome to the Food Safety Nook. Today we're going to be talking about how the preventive controls for human food regulations got here in the first place. Now, they got here originally because of legislation. So, in other words, U.S. Congress and Senate voted on an act. In this case, it was the Food Modernization Act of 2011. And it was voted upon, signed by the President, and in that way was enacted into law. Now, all the laws of the land come about this way. Right, so they all start with a bill that's voted upon. In this case, the bill was referred to as an act. The act was a package of statutes. When enacted into law, we refer to these statutes or as laws. These statutes are codified. So in other words, they're codified in what's called the U.S. Code. The U.S. Code is something that food safety professionals generally don't go to. There are some circumstances when we will go there. For example, if we want to see the definition of adulterated or misbranded, which you may have seen referenced in recall notification letters. But other than that, it's fairly rare that we'll go to it. There are essentially three different ways that FDA will refer back to laws or statutes. The first is by referring back to the section in the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. The second is by referring back to the section where they perhaps came from in their specific act. For example, FDA could refer back to a specific section in the Food Modernization Act, which of course was designed to amend the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So they have a choice there. They could refer to it in one way or the other. They tend to refer back to the amended section of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Now the third way, and this is referred to sometimes by FDA in guidance and elsewhere, is by referring to the U.S. Code. Regardless of how they might reference these statutes, the statutes provide the authority, the statutory authority is what we call it, that gives FDA the power to be able to create regulations and enforce those regulations. Now, regulations are not just created by FDA willy-nilly. They don't say, hey, I think this would be really great. It would help make sure that food is safe. What they would do is they would go back to the statutes that provide them with the authority, and based on the statutes, determine what might be appropriate to implement the will of Congress. Right? So when the Food Modernization Act came out, that was the will of Congress, and FDA was tasked with implementing it. And that's why we refer to regulations oftentimes as implementing regulations. All right, so now let's step back. So it starts with legislations voted upon. It's enacted into law, in which case it is then codified in the U.S. Code. FDA creates regulations through what's called a rulemaking process, in which case they propose regulations and then they open up what's called a comment period. In this comment period, they're getting feedback from people, for example, in the industry or other regulators, maybe at the local, state level. And with this input, with this feedback, they will then revise their proposed regulations and then propose the new version of their proposed regulations. Once there's a rule that's finalized and that regulation is codified into the CFR, or in other words, the CFR is amended to include them, there's generally a period of time where they're not being enforced. The compliance dates are set sometime in the future. And in that little waiting period, we have typically guidance that's prepared and published by FDA. There's also trainings that can be developed. In this case, with Preventive Controls for Human Food Regulation, we saw FDA funding the Food Safety Preventive Controls Alliance, FSPCA, and they developed a standardized curriculum for industry. And lastly, once people are trained, prepared with guidance, and have had time to digest the regulations, they're prepared for inspection. And that's the process which we went through. Now, if you want to go back and you want a voice to, say, represent your industry, or to make sure that what regulations are developed and enforced are realistic, make sure that you get involved in that rulemaking process. As food safety professionals, being aware of the comment period is just as important as casting a vote. I hope you enjoyed this video. Stay tuned. We're going to be diving into preventive controls for human food regulations subpart by subpart.